America is winning the trade war. That's what the headlines keep telling you. Tariffs are working, decoupling is happening, China's economy is crumbling. Except here's the problem with that narrative: it's completely demonstrably false. And the number that proves it isn't some vague estimate or projection, it's $800 billion. That's how much China's global trade surplus exceeded America's in the last fiscal year. Not 800 million, 800 billion with a B. Let me be very clear about what this means. While Washington celebrates bringing back a few semiconductor factories and restricting TikTok, Beijing has quietly constructed the most dominant trade network in modern history, and the gap isn't closing, it's accelerating. I spent 3 weeks in Guangzhou and Shanghai earlier this year talking to factory owners, logistics managers, and trade officials. What they told me off the record doesn't match anything you're hearing from cable news or think tank reports. So here's what I'm going to show you in this analysis. The 3 systems China has deployed that make the America is winning narrative not just wrong, but dangerously misleading. Because here's what nobody tells you about those $800 billion. That's not just trade volume, that's structural power. That's the ability to set terms, dictate supply chains, and make entire industries dependent on your manufacturing base. And it's happening while American politicians argue about whether we're tough enough on China. The first system is what I call the alternative infrastructure network, and it's the one that should terrify anyone who actually cares about American competitiveness. Most analysts focus on China's Belt and Road Initiative like it's some kind of charity project or debt trap scheme. They're missing the entire point. What China has built over the last decade isn't just roads and ports in developing countries. It's a parallel global trading system that bypasses Western financial infrastructure, maritime choke points, and even the dollar itself in many transactions. Here's the specific data that matters. China now operates or has significant control over 96 ports in 53 countries. Not 10 or 20, 96. These aren't small facilities. We're talking about Piraeus in Greece, which handles 5.6 million containers annually, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Godar in Pakistan, Djibouti, which sits at one of the most strategic maritime locations on Earth, right at the entrance to the Red Sea and Suez Canal route. But here's where it gets really sophisticated. These ports aren't just loading and unloading Chinese goods. They're creating dedicated trade corridors where Chinese customs systems, Chinese logistics software, and Chinese financing mechanisms become the default standard. When a Pakistani manufacturer wants to ship to Africa, they're not using American systems anymore. They're plugged into Chinese infrastructure that's faster, cheaper, and specifically designed to keep transactions inside Beijing's economic sphere. Let me show you what this actually means on the ground. A factory owner in Guangzhou told me something fascinating. He ships electronics components to Vietnam, where they're assembled, then sent to Kenya through Chinese-operated ports, financed with Chinese credit lines, and tracked through Alibaba's logistics platform. At no point does that transaction touch American infrastructure or require dollar conversion. It's a completely parallel economy, and it's processing trillions of dollars in annual trade. The United States has, a few trade agreements we keep threatening to abandon. The Port of Los Angeles, which can barely handle current volume without creating massive backlogs. This is the part that should surprise you. While America spent 20 years and $7 trillion on wars in the Middle East, China spent roughly the same amount building this alternative network, except their investment actually generates returns. Every port, every rail line, every customs facility creates structural dependence that makes Chinese trade more attractive than American alternatives. And that $800 billion gap, it's not happening despite American tariffs. It's happening because the infrastructure system China built makes those tariffs almost irrelevant for most of the world's trade flows. Here's what makes this even more concerning. These infrastructure networks aren't static investments. They're dynamic systems that improve with scale. The more volume that flows through Chinese ports, the more efficient they become. The more countries that integrate with Chinese customs software, the harder it becomes to switch to alternative systems. Stay with me because the second system is even more sophisticated, and it's the one that makes most Western economists completely miss what's actually happening. It operates in plain sight, but almost nobody understands how it actually functions. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently. I call it the manufacturing complexity monopoly. And it's built on something that sounds boring, but is actually the most powerful economic weapon of the 21st century: supply chain integration density. Here's what most people think. They think tariffs make Chinese goods more expensive, so companies move production to Vietnam, Mexico, or back to the United States. Simple economics, right? Except that's not what's happening. Not even close. Let me show you the numbers that matter. The average Chinese manufactured product contains components from 7.3 different Chinese provinces and involves 14.2 separate specialized suppliers. I'm not making these numbers up. This comes from a McKinsey supply chain analysis from late 2023. Now compare that to Vietnam, where the equivalent product involves 3.1 suppliers, most of whom are actually Chinese companies that relocated basic assembly operations. What does this mean in practice? It means China hasn't just built factories. They've built entire industrial ecosystems that can't be replicated quickly or cheaply anywhere else on Earth. A senior trade analyst in Shanghai explained it to me this way, and I'm paraphrasing what he said off the record. You Americans think manufacturing is about having a factory. You're wrong. It's about having the factory plus the specialized machinery supplier 3 kilometers away, plus the custom component fabricator, plus the quality testing facility, plus the packaging operation, plus the logistics coordinator who can get everything to the port in 18 hours. We have all of that within a 50-kilometer radius. You have what? Speeches about reshoring? Here's the uncomfortable truth that makes people in Washington very uncomfortable. Even when companies announce they're leaving China, they're not really leaving China. They're doing what's called China Plus One strategies. They'll move final assembly to Vietnam or India to avoid tariffs, but 70 to 80% of the components still come from Chinese suppliers. Apple is the perfect case study. After years of talking about diversifying away from China, where does the iPhone get manufactured? Officially, India is now making some units. Fantastic headline. But here's what that actually means. Chinese suppliers ship components to Indian facilities where they're assembled, then labeled made in India. The value added in India, roughly 12 to 15%, the other 85%, still captured by Chinese manufacturers. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because what comes next shows you exactly how this monopoly compounds itself. The manufacturing complexity monopoly creates what economists call increasing returns to scale, but that's jargon. Here's the real version. The more companies that use Chinese supply chains, the more efficient those supply chains become, which makes them even harder to compete against. China graduates 4.7 million STEM students annually. The United States graduates around 568,000. But it's not just the quantity. Chinese engineering students spend their internships in factories learning actual production processes. They understand injection molding tolerances and PCB fabrication specs because they've worked on factory floors. American engineering students learned theory and maybe do a summer at a tech company. This creates a technical workforce that can solve manufacturing problems in real time. A factory manager in Shenzhen told me they can go from prototype to production ready in 48 hours for many products. 48 hours. In the United States, that same process takes weeks, often months, because we've lost the institutional knowledge of how to actually make things at scale. Here's what this means for that $800 billion trade gap. It's not about cheap labor anymore. Chinese manufacturing wages have increased by roughly 400% over the last 15 years, but the gap keeps growing because they've built something more valuable than cheap workers: irreplaceable expertise. When American politicians talk about bringing manufacturing back, they're imagining we can just build some factories and flip a switch. But you can't rebuild 40 years of accumulated knowledge and integrated supply networks with tax incentives and subsidies. It doesn't work that way. Here's what nobody's telling you. That institutional knowledge, the expertise of knowing how to optimize a production line, how to source the right materials, how to solve quality control issues in real time, that takes decades to develop. China has spent those decades building it while America was financializing its economy and focusing on services. And this connects to something even bigger, because the third system is the one that actually terrifies me when I look at the long-term trajectory. It's operating right now, and most people don't even realize it exists. The third system is what I call demand capture through market access, and it's the most misunderstood part of this entire equation. Because while America has been trying to restrict what China can buy from us, China has been doing something far more strategic, making themselves the customer that nobody can afford to lose. Here's what the mainstream narrative gets wrong. They focus obsessively on China buying American soybeans or Boeing aircraft, as if trade is just about transactions. But here's what's really happening. China has systematically positioned itself as the critical market for virtually every major industry on Earth. And once you're dependent on Chinese consumers for your growth, Beijing doesn't need to compete with you anymore. They control you. Let me show you what this actually means with specific numbers. China represents 32% of global luxury goods sales, not 15% or 20%, 32%. For automotive, they're 35% of global vehicle sales. For semiconductors, they purchase 60% of global chip production. For industrial machinery, mining equipment, pharmaceutical ingredients, the percentages are similar. China isn't just a big market, they're the market that determines whether your company grows or stagnates. Most people think this makes China dependent on imports, but here's the paradox. It actually makes exporters dependent on Chinese approval. When I was in Beijing last year, a European automotive executive told me something revealing over dinner. He said his company had spent 3 years developing an electric vehicle specifically for Chinese consumers. They modified the software interface, changed the interior dimensions, adjusted the suspension. 3 years and roughly 800 million euros in development costs. Then a Chinese regulator suggested they might face compliance issues unless they formed a joint venture with a local partner, meaning they had to hand over their technology to a Chinese competitor. What did they do? They signed the joint venture agreement because walking away meant abandoning 35% of their global sales. That's not trade, that's leverage. Here's the part that should terrify you. This same pattern repeats across every major industry. Want access to Chinese pharmaceutical markets? Transfer your drug formulations to a Chinese partner. Want to sell financial services? Let Chinese regulators access your risk models and client data. Want to operate cloud services? Store everything on servers that Chinese intelligence can access. And American companies are making these deals every single day because the alternative is watching your competitors capture growth while you stagnate. The America is winning lie depends on ignoring this reality. Yes, the United States has restricted some technology exports to China. Semiconductors, certain AI systems, advanced manufacturing equipment. Sounds tough, right? Except here's what nobody tells you. Those restrictions hurt American companies more than they hurt China in many cases. ASML, the Dutch company that makes extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, lost 8.7 billion euros in potential Chinese sales due to US pressured restrictions. Did China stop advancing semiconductor production? No. They just accelerated domestic development and started buying from non-American suppliers wherever possible. Meanwhile, ASML's American competitors gain nothing because they don't have equivalent technology. Here's the uncomfortable truth that makes Washington policymakers very uncomfortable. Economic decoupling doesn't work when the other side controls market access that your companies desperately need. This is exactly $297 billion in annual American exports to China, supporting roughly 1.2 million American jobs directly and another 2.8 million indirectly. Those aren't abstract statistics. Those are automotive workers in Michigan, soybean farmers in Iowa, semiconductor designers in California, and aircraft engineers in Washington state. Their livelihoods depend on Chinese market access. So when politicians talk about getting tough on China, what they're actually proposing is economic pain for American workers and companies, while China redirects purchases to European, Japanese, and Korean competitors who are happy to take our market share. If you want to understand why that $800 billion trade gap keeps growing, just look at this asymmetry. China can restrict American access without breaking their own economy because they've built alternatives. America can't do the same because we haven't. Here's what makes this particularly dangerous. Every year this continues, China's position strengthens while America's weakens. The companies that make technology transfer deals today become dependent on Chinese partnerships tomorrow. The markets we lose to European and Asian competitors don't come back easily. Let me pull this together and show you what this actually means for the next decade, because these three systems create a feedback loop that most analysts completely miss. So let me pull this together because these three systems, the alternative infrastructure network, the manufacturing complexity monopoly, and demand capture through market access, aren't operating independently. They're reinforcing each other in a way that compounds China's structural advantages every single year. Here's what this actually looks like when you zoom out. Chinese companies use the infrastructure network to move goods more efficiently and cheaply than Western competitors. That increased efficiency strengthens their manufacturing ecosystem, which attracts more suppliers and expertise. That concentrated expertise makes them indispensable to global supply chains. And that indispensability gives them leverage to demand market access concessions, technology transfers, and favorable terms, which generates revenue that funds more infrastructure investment. The cycle repeats and accelerates. This is what I call the compound dominance framework. And it's why that $800 billion gap isn't a temporary blip or a COVID-era anomaly. It's a structural reality that's going to define the next 20 years of global economics. A former Treasury official told me something striking last month. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "We keep measuring success by what we restrict China from doing. They measure success by what they've built that we can't replicate. Those are completely different games, and we're losing the one that actually matters." That's the core insight most analysis misses. American policy is reactive and defensive. Chinese policy is proactive and constructive. We're playing checkers. They're playing Go. And in Go, you win not by capturing pieces, but by controlling territory. Here's what makes people uncomfortable. Reversing this trajectory would require America to do things we're currently unwilling to do. Massive infrastructure investment, not just roads and bridges, but ports, rail networks, and digital customs systems that can compete with Chinese efficiency. Industrial policy that supports entire supply chain ecosystems, not just individual factories. Long-term strategic planning that survives beyond election cycles. Deep educational reform that produces millions more engineers who understand manufacturing, not just software. Are we doing any of that? Not at scale, not with urgency, not with the kind of generational commitment that China has demonstrated. So let me give you 3 scenarios for how this plays out over the next decade. Scenario 1, continued divergence. China's trade dominance grows to a $1 trillion gap by 2030. More countries integrate into Chinese infrastructure and financial systems. The dollar's role in global trade continues eroding gradually. American manufacturing continues hollowing out except in a few protected sectors. This is the current trajectory if nothing changes fundamentally. Scenario 2, manage competition. The United States makes serious structural investments in manufacturing ecosystems and infrastructure. We don't catch China, but we stop the bleeding and create viable alternatives in critical sectors. The world becomes genuinely multipolar with different regions gravitating toward different economic systems. This requires political will we haven't demonstrated yet, but theoretically could. Scenario 3, disruption event. A major crisis, conflict over Taiwan, global financial collapse, pandemic worse than COVID, forces a rapid, chaotic restructuring of global trade. All bets are off. Supply chains break. Countries scramble for self-sufficiency. The outcome depends entirely on who can adapt fastest under extreme pressure. My assessment, Scenario 1 is 70% likely. Scenario 2 is maybe 20%. Scenario 3 is 10%, but with catastrophic consequences if it happens. Here's what I need you to understand. That $800 billion figure isn't about trade statistics. It's about power. Economic power translates to geopolitical influence, military capacity, technological advancement, and ultimately the ability to shape global rules and norms. When China controls infrastructure, manufacturing, and market access simultaneously, they don't need to defeat America militarily. They just need to make themselves indispensable while making us increasingly irrelevant. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. The question isn't whether China is rising. That's already happened. The question is whether America can build alternative systems before the gap becomes insurmountable. And the honest answer? I don't know. The window is closing fast. So here's my question for you, and I want you to answer this in the comments. Do you think America can actually reverse this trajectory, or are we just managing decline at this point? Because I'm genuinely torn on that question, and I want to know what you're seeing from where you are. If this analysis changed how you understand the US-China economic competition, subscribe because I'm breaking down the semiconductor war next week, and those numbers are even more shocking than what I've shown you today.